August 1943, 2:17 p.m. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The transport train hisses to a stop under a sky so thick with humidity it feels like drowning. Unteroffizier Werner Schafer steps onto the platform, wrists bound with rope, uniform soaked through with sweat, and 3 days of travel. The heat is nothing like North Africa. This heat is alive. It breathes. An American sergeant approaches, clipboard in hand. "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" the sergeant asks. Werner stares. The accent is strange, clumsy, but the words are unmistakably German. "Ja," he manages. The sergeant nods and continues in German, slow but functional. "You'll be processed. Medical exam, barracks assignment. You follow the rules, we follow the rules. Verstehen?" Werner nods, still processing what he's hearing. A language he thought belonged only to the Reich, spoken here. In the heart of enemy territory, by an American soldier who looks at him not with hate, but with something closer to indifference. That indifference somehow felt safer than anything he'd expected. If stories like this, the human moments buried in history, interest you, consider subscribing. These are the details that textbooks miss, but they're the ones that matter most. The propaganda machine had been thorough. Captured German soldiers, especially those taken in North Africa and Sicily, had been conditioned to expect the worst from American captivity. Starvation, beatings, forced labor until collapse. Mass executions disguised as accidents. Goebbels had spent years painting America as a mongrel nation, weak, decadent, incapable of maintaining order or discipline. A country where criminals ran the prisons and prisoners were treated worse than animals. Werner had believed most of it. Why wouldn't he? He'd seen the devastation Allied bombers left behind. He'd watched entire cities burn. If they could do that to civilians, what would they do to soldiers? He expected cruelty. He expected chaos. He expected to die in Louisiana. The medical exam came within an hour of arrival. Werner was led into a clean wooden structure that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. An army doctor, middle-aged, balding, utterly disinterested in conversation, examined his feet, his teeth, his old shrapnel wound from Tunisia. The doctor made notes, asked questions through an interpreter, applied iodine to a minor infection Werner hadn't even mentioned. Then the doctor handed him a tin cup filled with water. "Drink," the interpreter said. "You're dehydrated." Werner took the cup. It was plain stamped tin, slightly dented, the kind of object that means nothing until it means everything. He drank. The water was warm but clean. The doctor didn't watch, didn't care, just moved on to the next prisoner. That tin cup became the first symbol. Not mercy, practicality, not kindness, procedure. But somehow that made it more real. What Werner didn't yet understand was that his treatment wasn't an accident. It was systematic. The United States had committed to strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Not from altruism, but from calculated strategic reasoning. First, security. Prisoners who were fed, housed, and treated fairly were easier to manage. Riots and escapes dropped to near zero when basic needs were met. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided better information during interrogation. A man who expected to survive had more reason to talk. Third, reciprocity. America had thousands of its own soldiers in German and Japanese custody. Any mistreatment of Axis POWs invited retaliation against American boys held in camps across Europe and the Pacific. Fourth, morality. There was a belief, perhaps naive but genuine, that how a nation treated its defeated enemies defined what kind of civilization it was. By late 1943, over 170,000 German prisoners were held in camps across the United States, primarily in the South and Midwest, where labor shortages were acute. They were housed in converted civilian conservation corps camps, fed rations that matched or exceeded US Army training standards, and provided medical care that was often better than what they'd received in the Wehrmacht. The mortality rate among German POWs in US custody was less than 1%. The system worked not because it was kind, but because it was efficient. Restraint was policy, order was culture, and both would quietly dismantle everything Werner had been told. Processing took most of the afternoon. Name, rank, serial number, unit designation. Recorded by a clerk who spoke passable German. Another shock Werner couldn't quite process. His personal effects were catalogued and stored. A watch, a wallet with a photo of his wife, a small Protestant prayer book. Everything tagged. Everything returned. Then came the barracks assignment. Wooden buildings with screened windows, rows of cots with thin mattresses and wool blankets. Not comfortable but dry. Clean, organized. The posted rules were written in both English and German. Roll call at 600 and 1800. Work assignments posted daily. Male privileges subject to censorship. Escape attempts will result in solitary confinement. Cooperation earns privileges. Resistance loses them. Simple, clear, no ambiguity. Then came the first meal. Boiled rice, red beans, cornbread, chicory coffee. Werner ate slowly, mechanically, waiting for someone to take the plate away or reveal it was a trick. Neither happened. Around him, other prisoners ate with the same cautious disbelief. One man, a corporal from the 10th Panzer, ate his cornbread in 4 careful bites, then sat staring at his empty plate for a long time. No one spoke. There was nothing to say yet, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The real shock came 3 days later. Werner's work detail was assigned to a sugarcane farm 15 miles outside Ruston. The detail consisted of 12 prisoners, 1 guard, and a farmer named Otto Hebert. Hebert was in his 60s, built like a barrel, with sun-darkened skin and hands that looked like they'd been carved from wood. He walked the prisoners through the work, cutting cane, bundling stalks, loading wagons, and halfway through the explanation, he switched seamlessly from English to German. Not textbook German, not Wehrmacht German, a dialect Werner recognized from the Rhineland, heavily mixed with French loanwords, but unmistakably Germanic. Werner stopped mid-stride. "You speak German?" he asked, too surprised to maintain the prisoner's usual caution. Hebert shrugged. "My grandparents came from Alsace. Everybody around here speaks some German. Or used to." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon, as if the entire parish was populated by ghosts of the old country. "You're not the first Germans to work this land," Hebert said. "Won't be the last." That night, back in the barracks, Werner tried to explain what he'd learned to the others. Louisiana, it turned out, had been a destination for German immigration since the 1720s. Tens of thousands had settled along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi River Basin, bringing with them traditions, language, and agricultural knowledge that had been woven into the fabric of the region for over 2 centuries. The prisoners had expected to land in hostile territory. Instead, they'd found echoes of home. The work itself was hard but honest. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sugarcane harvesting in late summer and fall. Rice planting in spring. Maintenance work during the off-season. The pay was 80 cents per day in camp scrip, usable for canteen purchases. Cigarettes, toiletries, candy, writing paper. Geneva Convention rules were enforced. No military production, no forced labor beyond reasonable agricultural work, no abuse. Supervision was light. 1 guard per 10 to 12 prisoners, often unarmed or carrying only a sidearm for show. Escape was technically possible, but where would they go? This was rural Louisiana. A German accent would be noticed instantly, and increasingly, escape didn't seem worth the risk. The food improved with good work. Extra rations for particularly hard days. Cold lemonade in the fields when the heat was unbearable. On Sundays, the prisoners rested. It wasn't freedom, but it was structure, routine. A kind of dignity that came from competent work fairly compensated. Werner found himself taking pride in the efficiency of his cane cutting. It was absurd, he knew. He was a prisoner. But the alternative, listlessness, despair, was worse. Honest work for honest treatment. The equation was simple, and both sides honored it. The relationship with local civilians evolved slowly. At first, the farmers viewed the prisoners with suspicion and pragmatism. They needed labor. The prisoners provided it. Nothing more. But over weeks and months, something shifted. Otto Hebert began conversing with Werner in German during breaks, asking about his family, his home region, the state of German agriculture before the war. The conversations were careful, apolitical, focused on practical matters, but they were human. Hebert's wife, Marie, began packing extra sandwiches for the work detail, thick slices of bread with ham and mustard wrapped in cloth. She'd hand them out without fanfare, the same way she'd feed any group of workers on her property. One afternoon during a rainstorm, the prisoners were invited into the farmhouse kitchen to wait out the weather. Marie served coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute from the camp, and set out a plate of sugar cookies. The prisoners sat stiffly, unsure whether this was a test. But Marie just went about her business, occasionally offering more coffee in clumsy but comprehensible German. "Möchtest du mehr Kaffee?" she asked Werner. He nodded. Bitter. She poured. It was the smallest of interactions, but it cracked something open inside him. These people weren't monsters. They weren't barbarians. They were just people, tired, practical, going about their lives while a war raged on distant continents. And they spoke his language. In October 1943, a prisoner at Camp Ruston, a former infantryman named Klaus, collapsed during a work detail. Heat exhaustion compounded by an undiagnosed heart condition. He was rushed to the camp hospital, treated by an American Army doctor, and kept under observation for 3 days. The treatment included IV fluids, rest, and medication that Klaus had never seen before. When he recovered, the doctor spoke to him through an interpreter. "You're going back to light duty for 2 weeks. No field work. You'll help in the kitchen. Understand?" Klaus nodded. "And you need to drink more water," the doctor added, almost irritated. "I don't care how tough you think you are. You drink water in this heat." Klaus returned to the barracks and told Werner what had happened. "They saved my life," Klaus said quietly. "Not because they like me, because it's procedure." That procedural care, indifferent, efficient, effective, was somehow more convincing than any act of personal kindness could have been. It meant the system worked. It meant this wasn't theatre. It meant they might actually survive this. Camp Ruston held a Christmas Eve service in the recreation hall. A Lutheran minister, a German-speaking American from New Orleans, led the service in both English and German. Hymns were sung. Stille Nacht echoed off the wooden walls, and for a few minutes the war felt very far away. After the service, the camp commander authorized a modest celebration. Each prisoner received a small package, a pack of cigarettes, 2 chocolate bars, and a handwritten card in German that read simply, "Frohe Weihnachten." No speeches, no propaganda, just a quiet acknowledgement that even in war, certain traditions remain sacred. Werner sat on his bunk that night, smoking an American cigarette and thinking about his son back in Bavaria. He wondered if the boy remembered him. He wondered if the house was still standing. He thought about the tin cup from his first day, the sugar cookies in Marie Haber's kitchen, the Christmas card, and he thought about the propaganda. If they'd lied about American brutality, what else had been a lie? Prisoners were permitted to write 1 letter per week, subject to censorship. Werner wrote to his wife in careful, neutral language. He described the camp, the work, the food. He avoided politics, avoided complaints. The censors would redact anything remotely controversial. But he allowed himself one honest sentence. "I am treated fairly. Do not fear for me." That letter, along with thousands of others, made its way back to Germany through Red Cross channels. And those letters, arriving in bombed-out cities where food was scarce and hope scarcer, told a story the regime couldn't control. The Americans weren't torturing prisoners. They weren't starving them. They weren't executing them in secret. They were following rules. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If the enemy was following civilized rules, what did that make the Reich, which increasingly was not? Werner never knew whether his letter reached his wife, but he kept writing them anyway, because the act itself, putting words on paper, imagining her reading them, kept him tethered to something beyond the barbed wire. If you're finding this perspective on the war compelling, please consider subscribing. There are hundreds of these stories, and most never make it into documentaries. By spring 1944, the restrictions had loosened considerably. Werner's detail was no longer escorted by an armed guard. Instead, a single sergeant would drive them to the farm in a truck, then return at the end of the day to pick them up. The prisoners worked unsupervised for hours at a time. Trust had been earned, slowly, through months of consistent behavior. One day, Otto Hebert handed Werner the keys to a tractor and gestured toward a field that needed ploughing. "Can you handle it?" Hebert asked in German. Werner nodded. He'd grown up on a farm. He knew tractors. "Good. I'll be back in 2 hours." Hebert walked away. Werner sat on the tractor for a long moment, keys in hand, alone in a field with no guard, no fence, no oversight. He could have driven the tractor to the road, could have tried to disappear into the countryside. He didn't. Instead, he started the engine and began ploughing. When Hebert returned 2 hours later, the field was finished. Werner handed back the keys without comment. Hebert inspected the work, nodded once and said, "Good." That was all. But it was everything. Werner couldn't identify the exact moment his thinking changed. It was cumulative. The tin cup. The Christmas service. The tractor keys. The German spoken by people who'd never set foot in Germany. But there was one evening, sitting in the barracks after a long day, when he said aloud what many had been thinking. "If they lied about America," Werner said, "they lied about everything." No one disagreed. The propaganda had painted America as weak, chaotic, on the verge of collapse, a nation of criminals and degenerates incapable of maintaining civilization. But the prisoners had seen something different. They'd seen order, restraint, abundance, infrastructure that ran smoothly even under the strain of global war, farms that produced enough food to feed millions, including prisoners, hospitals that treated enemy soldiers with the same care they gave their own. And they'd seen it all backed by a system so confident in its own strength that it didn't need cruelty to enforce compliance. Germany had tried to build an empire through terror. America had defeated its enemies by making them question what they were fighting for in the first place. That realization didn't come all at once, but once it started, it couldn't be stopped. By 1946, the camps were emptying. Werner was processed for return to Germany in February. The journey back was long, train to New York, then a crowded transport ship across the Atlantic, then processing through Allied facilities in France, before finally being allowed to cross into what was left of the Reich. Bavaria was unrecognizable. His hometown had been bombed flat. His wife had survived, living with relatives in a village 20 miles away. His son, now 8 years old, barely remembered him. Werner told his wife about Louisiana, about the tin cup, about Otto Hebert and the tractor and the Christmas service. She listened, holding their son, and said nothing for a long time. Finally she asked, "Was it better than here?" Werner thought about that. "It was different. It was decent." She nodded. She didn't ask for details. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he'd survived, and he'd come home with something the war hadn't taken. The memory of a world where enemies could treat each other with restraint. Some prisoners chose not to return immediately. Labor was needed in America, and the pay was better than anything waiting in occupied Germany. A few hundred across all camps eventually settled permanently, marrying local women, finding work, disappearing into the fabric of American life. Werner was not one of them, but he corresponded with Otto Hebert for the next 20 years, exchanging letters about harvests and family and the slow work of rebuilding. The tin cup Werner drank from on his first day at Camp Ruston was standard US Army issue, stamped metal, mass-produced, unremarkable. But to him, it was the symbol of everything that followed. It represented a system that extended basic decency even to defeated enemies. A culture that believed civilization wasn't suspended during war, it was tested by it. Germany had tried to conquer through ideology and terror. America had defeated its enemies by demonstrating that strength didn't require brutality, that order didn't require cruelty, that victory didn't require vengeance. The prisoners who passed through camps like Ruston went home carrying stories that contradicted the narratives they'd been fed. They'd heard their own language spoken by people who'd never left Louisiana. They'd been trusted with tractors and tools. They'd been treated as human beings even when their own regime had denied that same humanity to millions. And many of them spent the rest of their lives quietly questioning what they'd once believed. If stories like this resonate with you, the human details behind the history, please subscribe. These moments deserve to be remembered. The war ended in fire and tribunals and reconstruction, but it also ended in a tin cup of warm water handed to a thirsty enemy on a Louisiana train platform. That gesture, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, accomplished something artillery couldn't. It proved that real strength isn't measured in how fiercely you destroy your enemies. It's measured in how carefully you treat them once they've surrendered. Werner kept that memory until he died in 1982. The tin cup, the water, the sergeant's clumsy German. He told the story to his son, who told it to his children. And now it's yours. Because wars are won on battlefields, but civilization is proven in small moments. One cup, one gesture, one choice to remain human when everything else says you don't have to be.